Welcome to the English version of our weekly program, Para Ser Legal. My name is Andres Mejer, and here each week we're going to talk about three different subjects, all dealing with immigration. We're going to deal with a news segment that affects you, the immigrant population in some fashion. We're going to educate you. We're going to talk about some aspect of immigration that it's important that you know and understand. And then we're going to give you a real life example, one of our cases where we applied these principles to help you. This week, we're going to be talking about U.S. government denying passports to U.S. citizens. We're going to be educating you about what happens if your citizenship petition is denied and under what grounds can they deny it. And three, we're going to talk to you about Omar and why his citizenship petition was denied and his options to stay in the United States.
Calificas para ser legal, quieres saber, solo llama al abogado Andres Mejer.
Welcome back. So today, Trump administration denying passports to U.S. citizens. How's that possible? Well, pay attention. So in the 1950s and 1990s, along the Texas and Mexico border, around the El Paso area, there were midwives and a particular doctor that were issuing fraudulent birth certificates. So what they were saying is Andres Mejer was born in Texas, when in reality he was born in Mexico. Why does that matter? Because if a child born in the United States, that child's a United States citizen automatically. So now there were a lot of lawsuits in the 90s. Some midwives and a doctor admitted to making these fake birth certificates. But there's no way to prove which ones. So you have over 15,000, in some cases many as 20,000 births that are in question. So when these individuals go and apply to renew their passport or apply for a passport, they are either being denied or they're being asked to provide additional information about where they were born. Now, if I'm 40 years old and someone asks me about the details I was born in Santiago, Chile. So if they ask me of details about my birth in Santiago, Chile, I don't remember. Why would I? But I might need to show where was I living at the time? Where were my parents living at the time? Who was my doctor? Any medical records, any hospital records. Now, obviously, the older I am, the harder that it gets to find that information. But these are the type of questions that they're asking. And it happens in some cases to people who aren't in the United States. So let's say I'm retired. I'm not. But for purpose of conversation, let's say I'm retired. I'm 55 years old, and I spend half of my year in the U.S. I'm a U.S. citizen, and the other half in my country of birth. Let's say it was Panama. So in the winter, I'm in Panama. In the summer, I'm in the U.S. with my kids and my grandkids. So let's say I leave the U.S. My passport is now expired. I want to come back into the U.S. I go to the U.S. Embassy and I ask to renew my passport, something I've done, 2, 3, 4, 5 times in the past, and I'm denied. Well, now without that, how do I get into the United States? The answer is I can't. And those are the type of things that are happening. So Juan, who served 3 years in the military, he served as a border patrol agent, and now he's a state prison guard. He was denied his passport. He's 40 years old. He's lived his entire life in the U.S. Another individual who's 35 years old. He didn't give his name. He was crossing into Texas via Mexico. He was with his son, and a border patrol agent asked him where he was born. He said in the U.S., and they said, "Are you sure?" And he said, "Yeah, I'm sure." They didn't believe him. They put him in removal proceedings. They took away his passport, and he was separated from his son, who was a minor at the time. These are the things that are happening. It's just another example of Trump's war against immigrants. In this program, we've discussed in the past where he's kicked out of the military lawful permanent residents. And there's been lawsuits about that. Immigrants that were granted status in order to serve in the military because they had skills or languages that the military needed, well, they were kicked out of the program that they had come into the U.S. for, and in some cases deferred their education in order to serve. Trump created a denaturalization task force, a group of prosecutors and immigration officers whose sole job was to investigate and discover U.S. citizens, naturalized U.S. citizens, who received that citizenship under fraudulent circumstances so that they could be put in removal and so that their citizenship could be stripped and then deported. So we're talking, as an example, someone who committed a crime somewhere, sometime, and it wasn't disclosed in a petition, and then became a U.S. citizen because the FBI records weren't complete whenever he received his citizenship, but now they're saying, hey, you would not have gotten your citizenship had you not lied about that crime. Somebody who had an order of removal but under a different name, or an order of deportation under a different name. These things happen. I mean, we've talked about a client who was married 3 times to 3 U.S. citizen wives. Each of them filed a petition for him. The last one was in New Jersey. First was in Chicago. Second was in New York. The last was in New Jersey. And after he became a green card holder, New York petition was still pending. He was already divorced. He was separated. He had remarried. And in New York, they put him in removal proceedings. They sent the information to a wrong address. And they gave him an order of removal and he didn't appear in court. Yet New Jersey had already given him his green card. When does he discover this? He applies for citizenship and they deny it because he was ordered removed in absentia because he didn't appear to court. Now, this is the kind of stuff that happens. It wasn't fraud on his part. He had no way of knowing. He told immigration where he lived. An officer reviewed his case and an officer gave him his green card and a different officer put him in removal proceedings. You can't make some of this stuff up. It's just weird. But there are examples of actual fraud, and yes, maybe those shouldn't have received it. But, what happened 30 years ago, should somebody that committed a crime in 1982 be prevented from receiving his citizenship when he hasn't had anything else since then? I guess it depends on the crime and it depends on the case. We have some of those cases right now. But today, I'm not going to talk about those cases. The point is, if you were born in the Texas-Mexico border, let's say between 1950 and the year 2000, you need to look and figure out, okay, where was I born? Was it in a hospital? Who was the doctor? Was there a midwife? Your birth certificate usually has this information. The doctor that delivered you, or the midwife. And we can trace back, are you one of those 15 or 20,000 individuals that might be in question? So before you leave the U.S. on any trip, make sure you check that out first, all right?
I became an attorney to give others the information that I didn't have. I want them to know what their rights are. We're immigrants for immigrants. Almost everyone that works for us is either an immigrant or a child of an immigrant. We believe that an educated client is the best client. They should know what their rights are. Nothing compares to giving somebody legal status because their entire life has now changed. We get you, and we're here for you.
Now, we always like to educate. We like to inform. We believe that an educated client is the best client, which is why that our second part of this segment talks about, well, what are your options if they deny your citizenship? What are the common reasons why your citizenship might get denied? So there's a number of them. The most common one is saying, you're not a good moral person. What does that mean? Every immigration petition has a requirement that you're a good moral person. It's more of an absence of the negative, meaning there's no proof that you're not. There's no proof that you're a bad person. Now, who's a bad person? Somebody who's committed crimes. If you murdered someone, you're never becoming a U.S. citizen, and chances are you're not getting your residency. If you are or were a lawful permanent resident and then are convicted of murder, there's going to come a time when you're going to be deported. There probably isn't a whole lot of defense to that. Or at the very least, you might prove a basis to stay in the U.S. Let's say you're afraid to go back and you can prove asylum or withholding, but you're going to lose your residency and you'll stay under a different category. However, what happens if you have a traffic ticket? Well, if you're pulled over for speeding, you're not going to be denied your citizenship as a immoral person. But what about stuff in between? DUIs, sex abuse cases, assault, domestic violence, shoplifting, robbery, drug possession. So, I mean, it depends on the case and it depends on when it happened. So, for example, if you had one DUI and you've been here for 30 years, chances are you'll likely get approved if that's the only negative thing in your case. However, if that DUI was 2 months ago, it'll be a lot harder for you to show you're a good moral person than if it happened 10 years ago and never recurred. 10 years ago and never recurred, you can prove you've been rehabilitated, you made a mistake, and it never happened again. Same thing if you had 2 DUIs. The look-back period is 5 years. So immigration typically looks, listen, is there something in your past that disqualifies you, number one? If the answer is no, then okay. Is there something in your past 5 years that might make you immoral, that might make you a bad person, someone we don't want to give this benefit to? So crime, convicted of a crime, not accused, but convicted of a crime is the most common one. Now, if you're under probation, you're going to be denied automatically because immigration is going to wait to see, well, what happens if you violate your parole? If you violate your parole, you're now convicted, or you may have additional charges, new charges, or violation of probation, plus the underlying charge. So they're not going to, you're under probation, you're going to be denied automatically. If you're arrested and your case has not been resolved yet, they're going to adjourn your case until that case gets resolved. Again, because they want to see what the outcome is. You might be disqualified. They're not going to give you your citizenship and then have you plead guilty to something serious, the next day and have no consequences. 2 other common examples that might make you an immoral person are if you owe back taxes and you're not under a payment plan. If you owe child support, look, you could be married but separated. You could be divorced, or maybe you never married at all, but you've had a child with somebody. You have an obligation, a moral obligation, but also a legal obligation to maintain your children. That means you have to pay child support, and you got to be able to prove that you pay child support. It's like, I'm married, I have 2 kids. If I'm applying for citizenship, I don't have to prove that I pay child support. They live with me. I'm doing what I need to do. However, if I'm separated or I'm divorced, and a judge said I have to pay $300 a week in order to maintain my children, and if I fail to do that, I have a problem, and maybe I'm a bad guy in the eyes of immigration, and maybe I don't deserve to be a U.S. citizen. Now, what happens if I voted for something in an election before I was a U.S. citizen? Well, that's a problem. Even if I was registered to vote. So we have a client born in Italy, lived in New York for about 30 years, bought a house and moved to New Jersey, then went to the DMV, the Motor Vehicle Commission, to change his address, change his license from New York to New Jersey. And he checked off a box that said, do you want to be registered to vote? And he said yes. It was an accident. He didn't do it on purpose. And he was registered to vote. Now, he never voted. He found out when he got a ballot, before a presidential election, and he said, "Wait a minute, I know I'm not a U.S. citizen." He contacted that agency, and they were able to remove him from the rolls of registered voters. But that stuff happens. Another example, if you don't have the necessary residence period, what does that mean? Well, before you can file to be a U.S. citizen, you must have been a lawful permanent resident for at least 3 years if you got your green card through marriage, or 5 years if you got your green card for any other reason. So during that 3 or 5 year period, you have to have been in the U.S. at least half the time. So 3 years, that means, I don't know, 365 days a year, it's about 700 and change. 500 and change that I was 18 months that I was here. Now I might have left the U.S. and come back, but I couldn't have stayed outside the U.S. for more than 6 months. And in total, I have to have been in the U.S. for more than half of that time. I must have lived in New Jersey for more than 3 months before I filed for this citizenship petition. Our client, we'll just call him Mr. Italy. He needed to have lived in the state of New Jersey for more than 3 months before he filed. Otherwise, his petition would have been denied. And he can't have left the U.S. for more than 6 months in any one state. If he had left the U.S. for more than 6 months legally, went back to Italy, had an extended trip, came back 7 months later, U.S. is going to assume that it was his intention to stay in Italy and not come back. They may give him a hard time coming back to the U.S., but even if they let him come back to the U.S., he's going to have to wait 3 or 5 years from that entry before he can file for citizenship, unless he proves that it was his intention to stay. For example, he still maintained his house, he had a bank account, he had a job here, or he left for work and had an employment contract, and it was supposed to be 3 months, but it got extended for whatever reason. So he can prove that, but he would need to prove that. Now he's going to need to understand, read, and write English. It doesn't have to be at a high level, but they're going to ask you. They're going to give you a sentence, usually about 5 or 6 words. I can understand what I'm saying. You have to write it down, and then they're going to show you a sentence that's written down. They're going to ask you to read it. The entire interview is going to be in English, unless, under some circumstances, you can do it in Spanish. I'm sorry, you can do it in your native language. We've discussed those exceptions another time. Don't need to go into detail here. For purposes of here, you also have to pass your civics exam. There's 100 questions. They give you the questions. They give you the answers. They're going to ask you 10. You have to answer at least 6 of them correctly. Now, here's the kicker. This is the one this is why we're really talking right now. Because today, more than ever, they're denying citizenship petitions because they're saying, look, you received your green card fraudulently. You made an intentional misrepresentation. Now, for our purposes, it doesn't matter whether you lied or whether USCIS made a mistake. There's examples of both. What immigration is saying is, but for this lie or mistake, you would never have gotten your green card. Because you wouldn't have gotten your green card, you were never lawfully admitted to the United States. And for that reason, you're not getting your citizenship. Now, if that happens, sometimes they put you in removal proceedings and sometimes they don't. That's a decision that immigration does. It's a case-by-case basis. But you got to be careful. And you need to know what your options are and what you're facing before you go. So listen, your citizenship application, this N-400 form, it might be denied, in which case you could appeal, or you could go directly to district court and ask a federal judge to review it. I almost always recommend appeal because you're going to get a higher level individual reviewing it, and you get another opportunity to go in and supplement and address whatever concerns they make in their denial. It's faster and it's cheaper than than going to district court. You're not appealing to a judge. You're asking for a higher level individual within USCIS to review it. And in some cases, and usually that means you get another interview and you get an opportunity to speak to a supervisor. You get an opportunity to try to resolve it quickly and efficiently. But they might put you in removal proceedings. They might try to take away your green card. In which case, you do nothing, you get deported. You don't want that.
I became an attorney to give others the information that I didn't have. I want them to know what their rights are. We're immigrants for immigrants. Almost everyone that works for us is either an immigrant or a child of an immigrant. We believe that an educated client is the best client. They should know what their rights are. Nothing compares to giving somebody legal status because their entire life has now changed. We get you, and we're here for you.
So that was our education segment, and our case study, our success story. Well, in this case, it's not a success yet because we're not there yet, but we're going to talk about Omar. And that's exactly what happened to Omar. Omar filed for his citizenship. He got put into removal proceedings, and now he's trying to fight and stay in the U.S. Now, he had a prior attorney. He didn't like the way he was being treated. He came to us for a second opinion, and essentially say, hey, listen, what are my options? I don't want to be deported. I've been here for a long time. How can I stay? So let me give you the facts. Now, I will tell you, Omar is not his real name. Whenever we talk about case studies like this, the facts are usually 100% accurate, or sometimes some modification. Here, these facts are 100% accurate, but I changed his name for purpose of confidentiality. So Omar entered the United States November 20th, 1997 as a tourist in California. He was given a 6-month visa. He applied to extend it, and it was approved. But he overstayed beyond the time that he was given. So he overstayed by over 180 days, and he left on March 30th, 1999. Now, the moment he overstayed for 180 days or more, that means he couldn't re-enter the United States for at least 3 years without applying and receiving a waiver. But Omar didn't wait 3 years. He didn't even wait 1 year. November 16th, 1999, he entered the U.S. as a student. Now, in that petition, he would have been asked if he ever overstayed a visa. He would have said, likely no. I haven't seen the petition, so I don't really know. The government has said he lied, and that he said he had never been here in the U.S. when he had, and he had overstayed. In 2003, he was interviewed by immigration, and he signed a sworn statement saying since June 2002, he had not been attending school, and it was now March 2003. So never, never, never sign a sworn statement given to you by an officer unless you've had it reviewed by an attorney. It's usually not to your benefit. It's usually the officer is using that to box you in and to limit some option. And it's, again, usually not to your benefit. There are some circumstances where I have advised my client to sign it, and it helped us. But more often than not, it does not. But you absolutely need to have an attorney. He did not. So what's the relevance of this admission? He entered a student visa, and he failed to meet the requirements of that student visa because he wasn't studying, and he hadn't been for almost a year. He was put in removal proceedings. He took voluntary departure. That means the judge did not order him removed, which would have made him inadmissible. He just paid his own ticket and he went home. But because he was here for more than a year out of status, he couldn't come back for 10 years unless he approved and received a waiver. But you know where we're going here, right? He didn't wait 10 years. Matter of fact, it wasn't even 1 year. April 13, 2004, he filed for a diversity visa and was approved. He was asked, have you ever overstayed a visa? And he said, no. Again, I did not see that petition. I didn't see his answer. All I saw is a document from USCIS saying that he lied on the petition. If he did, that's fraud. January 24, 2005, he was admitted into the U.S. under the diversity visa from the United Arab Emirates as a lawful permanent resident. Diversity visa there's the only issue about 50,000 a year from countries that don't regularly send a lot of immigrants. So nobody from Mexico, China, India, they can't apply in the diversity visa. It's usually countries in part of the Middle East and in parts of North Africa, parts of Central America, that don't regularly send a high volume of immigrants. And each year that list changes. So he applied for it. He was approved. He was chosen. He entered. February 2012, 7 years later, he files for citizenship. In May 2012, he gets denied because he was not lawfully admitted into the United States. This is the category that we talked about in the prior segment, in our education segment. They're saying, listen, you lied. More than that, they said you committed fraud. You intentionally misrepresented facts that would have altered the outcome. Immigration is saying, had you, Omar, answered the question truthfully that you overstayed your visa, we never would have allowed you to enter the United States. But you lied, and because you lied, we didn't discover that you were previously here, and we allowed you to come in. Because that was fraud, they put him in removal proceedings. That was 2012. Now, for whatever reason, 4 years have gone by. He's had 3 court appearances with a decent judge. Nothing was filed. No relief was filed. So in some cases, his attorney didn't show up, and the case was adjourned. Suffice to say, he was not happy with his attorney. But now we need to say, what are we doing for him? So there's a number of different waivers available, but the one I'm going to talk about is under the Immigration Naturalization Act. It's referred to as Section 237A1H. So it's called the 237A1H waiver. That's just a statutory reference. So forget I said that because it's not really relevant for your purposes. What is important is the point of this waiver is to overcome a ground of fraud. So let's say for purpose of conversation, Omar received his green card through a sham marriage. He paid someone to apply for him and say that it's his wife and say that they're in a legitimate relationship when they're not. Now, that's not how he entered. But let's say for purpose of conversation, that is what happened. And this woman later did the same thing for another 4 or 5 people. Immigration discovered it. She was arrested. She was convicted. And now immigration is looking at all of those marriages, even if some of them were legitimate. And if any of them received an immigration benefit because of that relationship, they're questioning that relationship. Now, a lot of people have been discovered in that way. They may find an attorney that made up documents, or an organization, or a notario. So this stuff does happen. And it brings into question later petitions. Again, it didn't happen to Omar. But why am I saying this? Because even if he had committed a sham marriage and lied about it, this waiver that we're going to talk about solves it. Now, this waiver forgives the lie and forgives that ground of inadmissibility. What do I mean? So what happened to Omar? He filed a petition to come into the United States. It asked him, had he ever been in the United States before and overstayed a visa? He said no. So it forgives that lie. But if he was still inadmissible, but the waiver also forgives that ground of inadmissibility. So in his case, he overstayed a visa. Had the waiver not acted to forgive that overstay, the waiver would have no meaning. So today, Omar is inadmissible for 2 reasons: the visa overstay and the fraud. This waiver affects both. What are the requirements? He needs to have a spouse, parent, or child who's a U.S. citizen and green card holder, or green card holder. He needs to have he needs to show that an immigrant visa was available at the time he came into the United States. If it wasn't, then this waiver wouldn't help him. He needs to show that he was otherwise admissible. Again, he needs to show that the only reason why he was inadmissible was the lie and the underlying thing he lied about. If he also has criminal convictions, well, then this waiver wouldn't help him. He may have a different waiver for that. He also needs to show that he deserves discretion, meaning he's a good guy, or better said, he's not a bad guy. No crimes, doesn't owe back taxes or lack of child support, or whatever it is. Every case is unique. This is where the judge looks at the totality and said, okay, how has Omar touched his community? What are his relatives? Who's going to be affected if he's gone? If he doesn't work, if he's a hermit, if he lives out in the country somewhere, doesn't talk to anybody, doesn't see anybody, impacts nobody, well, that's going to be a harder case than the guy who goes to church, the guy who volunteers at organizations, has a good job, he's has 3 kids, has a U.S. citizen wife, brought in his parents. He can show how his whole community or his whole surrounding community would be affected without him. He can show the impact that he made. He can show that he's a good guy. So the judge is going to weigh the lie versus the good and decide on the totality, well, should I let this guy stay or shouldn't I? Omar has a good case. Omar has a U.S. citizen spouse. He has a minor child. He's employed. These events occurred more than 20 years ago. In some cases, 1999. That was 20 years ago. 2005, about 10 years ago. So he can show the person that he is and how he's impacted his community, and he's got a good shot at staying. Thank you for joining us to our English version of our program Para Ser Legal. Tune in next week.
Calificas para ser legal, ¿quieres saber? Solo llama al abogado Andres Mejer.